You have spent decades trying to be liked. Think about that for a moment. Decades. You learned how to soften your words so no one would be offended. You dressed a certain way, drove a certain car, said yes when you meant no. All because somewhere along the way you absorbed the idea that approval is the same thing as value, that what other people think of you is a measure of who you are. And here is the brutal part. It did not work. You already know that. The more you chased approval, the more exhausted you became. The more you shaped yourself around other people's expectations, the less you recognized the person looking back at you in the mirror. You might be thinking right now, but I do not do that anymore. I am past that. Maybe, but ask yourself this. When was the last time you changed your opinion mid-conversation because the other person seemed uncomfortable? When was the last time you downplayed something you were proud of because you did not want to seem arrogant? When was the last time you apologized for taking up space? That is not humility. That is a habit built on fear. The Stoics understood something about human nature that most people in the modern world have completely forgotten. They understood that the frantic need to impress others is not a sign of social intelligence. It is a sign of internal poverty. It means you have outsourced your sense of worth to people who are not qualified to hold it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "I have often wondered how it is that every man loves himself more than all the rest of men, but yet sets less value on his own opinion of himself than on the opinion of others." Read that again slowly. He wrote it almost 2,000 years ago, and it describes a person sitting in traffic right now, rehearsing what they are going to say at dinner so they sound impressive. It describes someone who just got a promotion but is already anxious about whether the right people noticed. Marcus was a Roman emperor. He had more power than almost any man alive at the time, and yet he kept returning to this question in his private journal. Why do we trust strangers with our self-worth more than we trust ourselves? Because it starts early, and it goes deep. By the time you are in your 40s or 50s, the habit of performing for an audience is so ingrained that you do not even notice it anymore. It is not something you think about, it is something you breathe. You walk into a room, and before you have said a single word, part of your mind is already scanning for approval signals. Who looked up? Who smiled? Who seemed indifferent? And here is what that costs you. Not just energy, though it costs you enormous energy. It costs you something rarer. It costs you presence. Because a person who is constantly managing their image cannot be fully present in any moment. They are always slightly outside themselves, watching, adjusting, performing. That is not a life. That is a rehearsal for a life you never quite get around to living. Epictetus knew this territory better than almost anyone. He was born a slave. He had no status, no property, no social position worth mentioning, and yet he became one of the most respected philosophical minds of his era. People traveled great distances to hear him speak, not because he performed for them, not because he was charming or flattering or careful with their feelings, but because when you were in his presence, you felt something rare. You felt that you were talking to a man who had nothing to prove. That quality is magnetic, and most people cannot explain why. They just know that certain people walk into a room and the energy shifts. Not because those people are loudest or best dressed or most accomplished, but because they carry themselves with a kind of settled weight. They are not auditioning. They are not scanning the room for validation. They are simply there, fully, without apology. Epictetus called this inner freedom. He taught that there are things within our control and things outside it. Your body, your reputation, what others think of you, outside your control. Your values, your judgments, your response to the world, fully yours. And the moment you begin treating outside things as if they were inside things, you have handed your freedom to someone who does not even know they are holding it. Think about a man you may know, or perhaps you have been this man, who spent 30 years building a career partly to impress a father who never quite said the words he needed to hear. Every promotion, every achievement quietly dedicated to an audience of one, and the father never said it. Maybe he could not. Maybe he did not even understand what was being asked of him. And the son reaches his late 50s with a successful career and a hollow feeling he cannot name, because the whole structure was built on the wrong foundation. It was built outward, toward an audience, instead of inward, toward a self. This is not a small mistake. This is the central mistake. And the Stoics were unrelenting on this point. Seneca wrote, "It is not that I am brave enough to ignore what people think. It is that I have finally understood that what they think is none of my business." That line sounds simple. It is not. It is one of the most difficult things a human being can actually practice, because we are social creatures. We are wired for belonging. The desire to be seen and accepted is not weakness, it is biology. The Stoics never said otherwise. What they said is this: there is a difference between wanting genuine connection and being enslaved to approval. One is human. The other is a prison with invisible bars. And most people spend their entire lives inside that prison, redecorating the walls, telling themselves it is a home. The man or woman who has done the inner work, who has decided what they actually value, what they actually believe, how they actually want to move through the world, that person becomes something rare. They become someone you cannot easily manipulate, someone you cannot flatter into compliance or shame into silence. And that, strangely, is what makes them profoundly attractive to others. So let us talk about what this actually looks like in practice. Because philosophy without application is just decoration, and you are not here for decoration. The first thing to understand is that stopping the approval-seeking habit does not mean becoming cold or indifferent or deliberately difficult. That is not freedom. That is just a different kind of performance. The man who makes a point of not caring what anyone thinks is still organizing his behavior around other people's opinions. He is just doing it in reverse. True indifference to approval is quieter than that. It does not announce itself. Here is something concrete you can do today. At some point in the next 24 hours, you will have a conversation where you feel the familiar pull, the urge to soften something you believe, to agree when you do not, to add a qualification to your opinion because the other person seems unconvinced. Notice that moment. Do not fight it dramatically. Just pause, one breath, and ask yourself a single question. Am I about to say this because it is true or because it is comfortable? That pause is where freedom begins, not in some grand gesture of rebellion, but in that one small moment of honest self-observation. The second practice is what Marcus Aurelius returned to again and again in his own life. He called it examining the impression. When something happens, someone ignores you, someone criticizes you, someone fails to acknowledge what you have done, your mind immediately generates an interpretation. And that interpretation almost always involves a story about your worth. They do not respect me. I am not important to them. I must have done something wrong. Marcus trained himself to stop at the raw fact. Someone did not reply to your message. That is the fact. Everything else, the story about what it means, the wound it opens, the hours spent replaying it, that is something you added. And you can learn to add less. This is not about suppressing your feelings. It is about not letting an unexamined story run your nervous system. The third practice is perhaps the most important and the most uncomfortable. Sit down, alone, with no distractions, and write down what you actually value. Not what you are supposed to value, not what sounds admirable, what you actually genuinely care about when no one is watching. Your relationships, your integrity, your work, your health, the kind of person you want to be in the last chapter of your life. Most people have never done this seriously. They have a vague sense of their values, assembled from other people's expectations and cultural noise. When you write them down, clearly, specifically, in your own words, something shifts. You now have an internal compass. And when you have an internal compass, you need other people's approval much less. Not because you have stopped caring about people, but because you have stopped needing them to tell you who you are. You might be thinking right now, this sounds straightforward. It is. Straightforward is not the same as easy. You have spent decades building one way of moving through the world. Rebuilding takes time, but it starts with a single, honest moment. Here is what no one tells you about the people you find most compelling in life. The ones you remember long after the conversation ends, the ones whose words carry weight, the ones who, when they give you a compliment, you actually believe it. They are not impressive because they tried to be. They are impressive because they stopped trying. There is a kind of person who has walked through enough of life, enough loss, enough failure, enough quiet nights with uncomfortable questions, to finally arrive at something solid inside themselves. They are not perfect. They do not pretend to be, but they know who they are. They know what they will and will not do. They know the difference between an opinion worth considering and noise worth ignoring. That person does not need to raise their voice. They do not need to dominate a room. They do not need you to validate them, because they have already done that work themselves. And that settledness, that unshakable quality, is the most attractive thing a human being can possess. Seneca wrote near the end of his life, "Retire into yourself as much as you can." He did not mean withdraw from the world. He meant stop looking outward for what can only be found inward. Stop measuring yourself against other people's reactions. Stop waiting for the applause that will never be loud enough anyway. You have earned the right to stop performing. Not because you are old, but because you are experienced enough to know that the performance never delivered what it promised. The approval you chased felt good for a moment and then evaporated, and you were left needing more. That is the nature of external validation. It is a hunger that cannot be satisfied from the outside. What satisfies it is this: knowing, with quiet certainty, that you lived according to something real, that you said what you meant, that you stood for something, that you were, in the fullest sense of the word, yourself. That is not arrogance. That is the finish line. And the remarkable thing, the thing the Stoics understood and modern culture has almost entirely forgotten, is that when you finally stop trying to impress anyone, you become genuinely impressive. Not to everyone, not to people who need you to perform for them, but to the ones who matter. The ones who recognize substance because they are searching for it themselves. Stop trying to be liked by everyone. Start being someone worth knowing. That is the only reputation worth building, and it is the only one entirely within your control.